Welcome, and thank you for being here with me tonight. You're listening to Sleepy Historian, a quiet place where the past is allowed to move slowly, where history is softened by distance, and where stories are told not to excite or alarm, but to gently accompany you as rest begins to settle in. Before we begin, there is no rush to focus too closely. You don't need to remember every detail or follow every sentence to its end. It's perfectly fine if your thoughts wander, if your attention drifts, or if sleep arrives before the story is finished unfolding. This narration is meant to be a steady presence, something calm and predictable, like a low fire or a familiar voice in a darkened room. If you're listening at the end of a long day, perhaps your body is already signaling its tiredness. The shoulders may feel heavy. The jaw may be holding tension without quite realizing it. You might notice the quiet weight of gravity as you rest where you are. Take a moment, if you like, to adjust your position slightly. Nothing dramatic, just enough to feel supported. A small shift, a slow breath in through the nose, and then gently a breath out. Tonight, we're going to talk about medieval castles. Not the grand versions often imagined in daylight, with banners flying and stone towers catching the sun. Instead, we're going to spend our time with them after sunset, when the light faded, when activity narrowed, and when life became smaller, quieter, and more uncertain within thick stone walls. This is not a story of battles or heroic moments. Those things tend to belong to daylight and to memories shaped by drama. Nighttime in a medieval castle was something else entirely. It was slower, colder, more repetitive. And for most people who lived within those walls, it was simply something to be endured one evening at a time. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the castle did not glow warmly into the night. There were no rows of windows shining with steady light. Instead, darkness arrived gradually, seeping into courtyards, corridors, and chambers. Shadows stretched first, then joined together, until the outlines of familiar spaces softened and blurred. For the people inside, sunset was not just a visual change. It was a signal, a reminder. Once the light was gone, movement became harder, work became slower, and choices became limited. What had not been done by evening would often wait until morning, if morning came easily at all. You can imagine, if you like, the sound of the final bell echoing faintly through stone passages. Gates being secured, wooden bars slid into place with dull, practiced motions. Voices lowering, footsteps becoming fewer. The castle turning inward on itself, conserving warmth, light, and energy. There's a reason we rarely hear much about medieval nights. They were not designed for storytelling. They repeated themselves endlessly, marked by small discomforts and long pauses. Yet, it was in these hours that the true limits of castle life became most visible. Stone, which offered protection during the day, began to release its stored cold. Floors chilled bare feet. Walls drew warmth slowly away from the body. Even those with status and rank could not entirely escape this. Heavy tapestries helped, thick clothing helped, but nothing truly erased the quiet presence of cold once darkness settled fully. Light, too, became precious. Candles were not burned freely. They were measured, saved, and often extinguished early. Many rooms were left in darkness altogether, not out of neglect, but necessity. Moving through a castle at night required memory as much as sight. Hands brushed along walls. Steps slowed. People learned the shape of familiar spaces by heart. Sleep itself was not always restful. It came in pieces, in shallow stretches, in moments interrupted by sound, by cold, or by simple discomfort. Straw mattresses shifted. Bodies pressed close together for warmth. Privacy was rare, and silence was never complete. And yet, this was normal. For those who lived there, night after night, these conditions were not extraordinary. They were expected, adjusted to, accepted with a kind of quiet resignation. As you listen, you might notice how different this feels from your own evening. Even if your day has been difficult, even if sleep does not come easily, there is likely warmth around you, light available at the smallest touch, a sense that night, while quiet, is not something to fear. For medieval castle dwellers, night carried uncertainty. Guards watched walls not knowing exactly what lay beyond them. Servants remained alert even while exhausted. Illness felt heavier in the dark when help was distant and time seemed to slow. Some nights passed without incident. Others ended quietly, without ceremony, without witness. This story is not told to unsettle you. Instead, it's meant to place you gently alongside these long-ago lives, to let you observe without urgency. There is no need to imagine yourself in danger. You're only listening, only resting. The past can remain where it belongs. As we continue, we'll move slowly through these hours after sunset. We'll notice routines, habits, and small details that filled the darkness. We'll listen to the sounds that replaced daylight activity. We'll sit with the stillness that followed the closing of gates and the dimming of candles. If you find yourself growing sleepy, that's exactly as it should be. You don't need to stay awake for every part. History does not mind being left unfinished for the night. Before we go further, if you enjoy these slow journeys into quiet corners of the past, you're welcome to like this video, subscribe to Sleepy Historian, or leave a gentle comment. It helps the channel continue, and it's always appreciated. There's no need to do it now. It can wait until another time, another day. For now, simply remain where you are. Let the story move at its own pace. Let the night feel long but not heavy. We are going back, slowly, to a time when darkness shaped every evening, and when survival depended less on sudden events and more on patience, endurance, and waiting for morning. As the day drew to its quiet close, the change inside a medieval castle did not arrive all at once. It happened slowly, almost politely, as though daylight was reluctant to leave without being properly dismissed. The sun lowered itself beyond the outer walls, and with it went the practical certainty that the day's work could still be completed. What remained was a softer, narrower time, shaped by habit and necessity rather than choice. The first sign was often sound. A bell, not loud or celebratory, but steady and familiar, carried through stone corridors and open courtyards. It did not rush anyone. It did not alarm. It simply reminded those within the walls that the day was ending, and that what came next required a different pace. People who had learned to live by this rhythm adjusted without discussion. Movements slowed. Voices softened. Tasks were finished not because they were complete, but because light was running out. If you were standing quietly in the courtyard at that moment, you might notice how shadows began to stretch across the ground, long and thin at first, then merging together as the light faded further. Stone that had been warmed through the afternoon held on to its heat for a while, but already it felt different underfoot. Cooler, less forgiving. The air shifted as well, losing the warmth that had lingered near the walls. Gates were next. Heavy wooden doors, reinforced with iron, were pulled inward and secured with practiced care. This was not done in haste. The people responsible had performed the same action countless times before. Bars slid into place. Locks were checked, not because danger was expected every night, but because night removed the option of quick response. Once closed, the castle became its own small world, sealed off until morning. Inside, servants made their last purposeful journeys of the day. Fires were adjusted rather than fed. Water was carried where it would be needed later. Animals were guided into their night enclosures, hooves and feet echoing briefly before settling into quieter sounds. There was no sense of anticipation, only completion. The understanding that certain things belonged to daylight and others to the long hours ahead. Light grew thinner. Windows, already narrow by design, offered little help once the sun dipped fully away. Torches and candles appeared, but sparingly. A single flame was often expected to serve a space where, earlier, daylight had filled the room freely. Shadows began to claim corners, then walls, then entire passages. Familiar places softened at the edges, their details fading into suggestion rather than clarity. For those who lived within the castle, this transition was deeply ingrained. There was no moment of surprise, no need to comment on it. Bodies adjusted almost automatically. Steps became more careful. Hands brushed against stone for guidance. People who had once crossed open areas confidently now stayed close to walls, using memory to navigate. You might imagine standing near a doorway, watching this quiet transformation take place. The courtyard that had once held movement and sound now felt larger and emptier, even though nothing had physically changed. The absence of light created space. The absence of noise created distance. Time itself seemed to loosen, stretching out as evening settled fully into night. Once the last practical tasks were done, there was little reason to linger in open areas. People drifted toward shared chambers, kitchens, or guarded spaces, drawn by the promise of warmth or company. The castle turned inward, gathering its occupants into fewer rooms, conserving not just heat and light, but effort. Every unnecessary step in the dark carried risk, however small. For guards, the work did not end. Their routines shifted rather than stopped. Posts were taken up along walls and near gates, eyes adjusting slowly to the darkness beyond the stone. The world outside the castle became harder to read. Shapes blurred, sounds traveled differently. A rustle in the distance could be nothing or something. Vigilance was maintained not through alert excitement, but through steady patience. Inside, those of higher status withdrew to their chambers, often larger, but no more immune to the cold creeping in from the walls. Servants and laborers settled where they could, arranging bedding and belongings with movements kept deliberately quiet. There was an unspoken agreement not to disturb the fragile calm that followed sunset. If you listen closely in your imagination, the castle at this hour does not sound silent. It sounds subdued. A cough here, a murmured word there, the faint crackle of a fire settling, wood beams responding to temperature changes with soft, almost conversational sounds. These were not interruptions. They were part of the night's texture. Emotionally, this time carried a gentle heaviness. Not fear exactly, but awareness. Awareness that help was farther away now, that choices were fewer, that the body would need to endure until light returned. For most, this awareness did not produce anxiety. It produced caution, the kind that encourages stillness rather than action. As the last light disappeared entirely, the castle became a place defined less by sight and more by sensation. Cool air against skin, the hardness of stone nearby, the closeness of other bodies sharing space. Night was not something to be filled. It was something to be waded through. And so, with gates secured and daylight gone, the castle settled into its evening state. Not asleep, but no longer awake in the way the day had been. A place holding its breath, conserving what it could, enduring what it must. If your own breathing has slowed while listening, that is fitting. This is the pace of the hour we're describing. Nothing rushed, nothing forced, just the steady movement from light into dark. Once the sun had fully withdrawn, the castle began a quieter transformation, one that could not be seen so easily, but could be felt almost immediately. The stone walls, thick and dependable by day, changed their role after sunset. They no longer guarded against heat. Instead, they released the cold they had been collecting slowly and patiently into every room and passage. At first, the change was subtle, a faint coolness along the floor, a chill that crept upward through leather soles and worn fabric. People noticed it without reacting much. This was expected. The body learned, over time, to recognize the early signs and adjust before discomfort became something harder to ignore. Cloaks were drawn closer. Sleeves were tugged down over hands. Those seated near walls shifted their positions, turning slightly, placing wooden furniture or folded cloth between themselves and the stone. These were small, habitual movements performed without discussion, repeated night after night as part of living within walls that never truly warmed. If you imagine walking slowly through a corridor at this hour, you would feel how the air settled differently. Heavier, still, the kind of cold that does not rush but waits. It lingered near the floor, pooled in corners, gathered beneath staircases where air rarely moved. Even breathing felt changed, the air cooler as it entered the lungs, the exhale faintly visible on the coldest evenings. Fires were precious, and they were not allowed to burn freely. Most were banked low after sunset, coaxed into a state that would last rather than flare. The warmth they provided stayed close to the hearth, leaving the rest of the room only marginally affected. Sitting near a fire was a privilege, often temporary, shared by rotation rather than comfort. Stone absorbed what little heat escaped and gave nothing back quickly. Beds placed near walls were known to be colder, and those who could chose positions farther inward, closer to other bodies or wooden structures. Straw mattresses offered minimal insulation, but even that thin layer mattered. Blankets, cloaks, and spare clothing were layered carefully, not for softness, but for survival through the night. There was no expectation of warmth as we understand it now. The goal was not comfort. It was endurance. To remain warm enough that fingers still moved in the morning. That joints did not stiffen beyond use. That sleep, however shallow, could happen at all. As hours passed, the cold deepened. It did not announce itself dramatically. It pressed slowly, steadily against skin and bone. People woke briefly to adjust coverings, to tuck fabric closer, to pull knees toward the chest. These movements were quiet, respectful of shared space, practiced enough not to disturb others. In rooms with higher ceilings, the warmth from bodies and fires never quite reached the upper air. Cold hovered overhead, invisible but present, reminding everyone of the distance between stone roof and ground. Drips of condensation sometimes formed where warm breath met cold walls, leaving faint traces that caught candlelight before disappearing again. Those tasked with tending fires through the night felt the cold most keenly. Stepping away from the hearth, even briefly, meant crossing an air that seemed to pull heat away instantly. Their hands, warmed near flame, stiffened again as soon as they returned to darker corners. The body was constantly negotiating, gaining and losing warmth in small increments. For guards on watch, the cold was a companion rather than an enemy. They leaned into it, stamped feet quietly, shifted weight from one leg to the other. Too much movement drew attention. Too little invited numbness. Finding balance was part of the work. The stone beneath them radiated cold upward, unrelenting, familiar. If you picture standing beside them, wrapped in heavy fabric, you might notice how time stretches in such conditions. Minutes feel longer when the body is occupied with staying warm. Thoughts slow. Focus narrows. Attention drifts toward sensation rather than planning. Night becomes less about what will happen and more about simply continuing. Inside the living spaces, conversation faded as cold settled more deeply. Speaking required energy, and energy was conserved. Silence was not uncomfortable. It was practical. It allowed rest. It allowed warmth to be held rather than lost. There were those who slept poorly, waking often as cold pressed against uncovered skin. And there were others who slipped into deeper sleep, bodies trained to accept discomfort as background rather than interruption. Both experiences were common. Neither was remarked upon in the morning. For children and the elderly, extra layers were arranged before sleep began, not out of sentimentality, but out of awareness. Cold took more from some bodies than others. Care was shown quietly, through actions rather than words. As the night progressed, the castle felt heavier, denser, as though the cold itself added weight to the air. Movement slowed further. Even the sounds softened, muffled by thick walls and heavy coverings. The world narrowed to the small space each person occupied, and the steady effort of remaining warm enough until dawn. If, as you listen, you feel an urge to pull a blanket closer or shift into a more comfortable position, that instinct connects you gently to these long-ago nights. You can adjust freely. They can only do so within limits. And so the stone walls held their cold, offering shelter but never softness. This was the balance of castle life after sunset. Protection in exchange for endurance. Safety in exchange for warmth. When darkness fully settled over the castle, light became something measured and intentional. It was no longer an open presence, freely offered by the sky, but a resource controlled carefully, shared reluctantly, and sometimes withheld altogether. Candles and torches existed, but they were never abundant. Each flame represented time, labor, and expense. Because of that, light was used sparingly, and often only where it was absolutely necessary. In many parts of the castle, darkness simply remained. Corridors that had once been navigated by daylight were now left untouched. Doors stayed closed. Corners disappeared entirely. People learned to accept that some spaces were meant for daytime only, and that night narrowed the world to a smaller, safer footprint. Where candles were lit, their light was modest. A single flame did not banish darkness so much as negotiate with it. Shadows gathered along walls and ceilings, moving gently as the candle flickered. Faces were half seen. Objects revealed themselves in pieces rather than fully. The castle became a place of fragments, known more by memory than by sight. If you imagine sitting quietly in such a room, you might notice how your attention would naturally fix on the small pool of light. Everything outside it would feel distant, even if it was only a few steps away. This focus was comforting in its own way. It reduced choice. It encouraged stillness. People moved differently under candlelight. Steps were shorter. Hands extended slightly ahead, feeling for furniture or walls. Turning corners required pause. Even familiar routes demanded care. A misplaced step could mean bruises, falls, or worse, and so movement slowed to match the limitations of light. Candles themselves were treated with respect. They were placed carefully, often in holders that caught dripping wax. Those spills were common. A candle left unattended was a risk, and so flames were watched closely. When no longer needed, they were extinguished promptly, leaving rooms to return to darkness without hesitation. In sleeping spaces, light was usually brief. A candle might be used to prepare bedding, to settle children, or to say a few quiet words. Then it was put out. Darkness returned quickly, and with it came the sounds that filled the absence of sight. Breathing, shifting fabric, the faint movement of someone nearby. Shadows, once light was gone, took on their own presence. They were not frightening by default, but they were unfamiliar. Shapes formed where the mind expected something else. A hanging cloak resembled a figure. A beam cast a longer outline than expected. Most people learned not to look too closely, trusting their knowledge of the space rather than their eyes. For guards and night workers, limited light was both protection and challenge. A torch carried along the walls made the bearer visible from afar, so light was often kept low or shielded. Eyes adjusted to darkness gradually. The night sky, moonlit or clouded, provided just enough contrast to distinguish movement beyond the walls. Inside, those remaining awake listened more than they looked. Sound traveled farther than light. A soft footstep could be traced. A door opening could be identified by tone alone. People learned the language of these sounds, recognizing what belonged and what did not. For those resting, darkness encouraged inward focus. Without visual distraction, thoughts wandered slowly. Memories surfaced. Worries appeared, then softened. Sleep came unevenly, guided as much by exhaustion as by calm. The candle's absence signaled that the day was finished, whether the body agreed or not. Children, especially, learned early that darkness was not optional. They adjusted quickly, sleeping close to others, finding reassurance in shared presence rather than sight. Adults did the same, though often with more awareness of discomfort. In private chambers, even among the higher ranks, light remained restrained. A single candle might burn briefly, then be snuffed out to preserve the remainder. Luxuries existed, but they did not erase the realities of night. Darkness treated everyone with equal patience. As hours passed, even the memory of light faded. The castle became a collection of quiet, breathing spaces, separated by walls and darkness. Time lost its usual markers. Without sun or clock, night was measured by wakefulness, by fatigue, by the slow anticipation of dawn. If you notice your own surroundings now, perhaps softened by low light or closed eyes, you may sense how darkness encourages rest. Unlike the medieval castle, Your darkness is chosen, not enforced. It carries safety rather than uncertainty. And so, with candles burned low and shadows settled firmly into place, the castle endured the rest of the night. Not brightly, not comfortably, but steadily, waiting for the faint promise of morning light to return. When night had fully settled and the last candles were extinguished, the castle did not empty into silence. Instead, it drew its people closer together. Sleeping arrangements inside medieval castles were shaped less by comfort and more by practicality, necessity, and the quiet understanding that warmth was easier to keep when bodies shared space. Very few people slept alone. Privacy, as we understand it now, was uncommon and often impractical. Rooms were shared by design, not as a social choice, but as a response to cold, darkness, and limited resources. The castle after sunset became a place where proximity offered reassurance, even if it also brought discomfort. Sleeping chambers varied in size and status, but nearly all shared similar features. Stone walls surrounded them. Ceilings were high. Windows were narrow and shuttered tightly against the night air. Beds, where they existed, were simple wooden frames strung with rope or fitted with rough supports. Over these lay straw mattresses, replaced periodically but never soft for long. Straw shifted as people lay down. It compressed beneath weight and redistributed itself unevenly, creating hollows and ridges that the body learned to accept. Blankets and cloaks were layered thickly, more for insulation than for restfulness. Fabric scratched, seams pressed against skin, but warmth mattered more than comfort, and so these irritations were tolerated without complaint. In larger chambers, servants, laborers, and retainers slept together, arranged in loose rows or clusters. There was little ceremony to it. Each person claimed a small space, just enough to lie down and turn slightly. Personal belongings were kept close, tucked beneath bedding, or used as makeshift pillows. The closeness of others was unavoidable. Breathing was heard. Movements were felt. A shift by one person rippled gently through the straw beneath another. At first, this closeness could feel intrusive, but over time it became familiar, even reassuring. It meant that someone else was awake if trouble arose. That warmth was shared rather than lost to the cold stone. For those of higher rank, sleeping spaces were larger, but rarely solitary. Lords and ladies often shared chambers with attendants or family members. Children slept nearby. Trusted servants remained within call. The idea of sleeping entirely alone, separated from others by distance and darkness, was uncommon and often undesirable. Curtains or tapestries sometimes divided spaces within a room, offering the illusion of separation rather than true privacy. These hangings softened drafts and absorbed sound, but they did little to block cold. Still, they provided a sense of boundary, however thin, and that was often enough. As people settled in for the night, movements became slow and deliberate. Boots were removed carefully. Outer garments were folded or draped nearby, ready to be used again if the cold deepened. There was no rushing. Night was long, and there was no benefit in hurrying towards sleep. In the darkness, conversations faded quickly. A few murmured words might pass between neighbors. A quiet reassurance, a reminder of the hour. Then voices lowered further, replaced by the sounds of settling bodies and adjusted coverings. Children often fell asleep first, their breathing evening out as exhaustion overtook them. Adults followed more gradually. Sleep came in layers, light and uneven. People woke briefly to turn, to pull a blanket higher, to adjust a cramped limb. These interruptions were expected and rarely remembered in the morning. The shared nature of sleeping meant that illness and discomfort were visible, even in darkness. A cough echoed softly. A restless sleeper shifted often. Those nearby noticed, but rarely spoke. There was little that could be done at night. Attention returned inward, to conserving warmth and energy. Despite the lack of comfort, these shared spaces offered a form of quiet security. The presence of others reduced the sense of isolation that night could bring. Even if sleep was shallow, it was not lonely. As hours passed, the rooms settled into a rhythm. breathing synchronized loosely. Movements grew fewer. The cold pressed gently at the edges, but warmth held in the center, created by clustered bodies and layered fabric. If you imagine lying there, surrounded by quiet signs of life, you may notice how the mind begins to slow. Without light, without tasks, without expectation, thoughts soften. The body rests not because it is comfortable, but because it must. This was rest inside a medieval castle. Not private, not luxurious, but sufficient. Enough to endure another day when morning eventually returned. When the lights were gone and most bodies had settled into their places of rest, the castle did not fall silent. Instead, it revealed a different kind of presence. Sound, rather than sight, became the primary way people sensed the world around them. In darkness, the castle spoke quietly, continuously, through small, familiar noises that marked the passing of the night. At first, there were the sounds of settling, straw shifting beneath weight, fabric brushing against fabric, a low murmur as someone turned and sighed before finding a more comfortable position. These sounds were expected, even comforting. They told those lying awake that others were nearby, sharing the same long hours. Beyond the sleeping chambers, the structure itself made its presence known. Wooden beams adjusted as temperatures dropped, producing faint creaks that echoed softly through corridors. Stone, cooling after the day's warmth, responded with subtle pops and sighs. These noises were not sudden. They unfolded slowly, like quiet conversation between materials that had stood together for years. Air moved through the castle in ways it never did during the day. Narrow windows and arrow slits guided wind along predictable paths, creating soft whistles or low hums. In some places, drafts caused shutters to shift slightly, tapping against stone with gentle persistence. These sounds repeated themselves night after night, familiar enough not to alarm. From the outer edges of the castle came the distant noises of animals. Horses shifting their weight, a cow lowing softly, dogs responding to something unseen with a brief bark before settling again. These sounds reminded those inside that life continued beyond the walls, even if it could not be seen. Inside, the rhythm of breathing gradually dominated. Slow, uneven at first, then more regular as sleep deepened. A cough here, and they're interrupted briefly, then faded. Someone spoke quietly in sleep, a few indistinct words that held no meaning for anyone listening. These were accepted without comment. Night was forgiving of such things. For those still awake, every sound carried a small question. Was it expected? Did it belong? Over time, people learned the language of the castle's night. They recognized which creak came from which beam, which footstep belonged to a guard making rounds, which noise signaled nothing at all. Footsteps were particularly noticeable. Soft leather soles against stone echoed faintly, then disappeared. Guards moved deliberately, spacing their patrols to avoid startling those inside. Servants attending to night duties walked carefully, aware that sound traveled easily when everything else was quiet. From kitchens or hearth rooms came the occasional crackle of a fire settling, a log shifting, a spark popping softly before returning to embers. These sounds are reassuring. Fire meant warmth, continuity, and attention. Even at a distance, the sound suggested someone was awake, watching. Outside the walls, the night offered its own soundtrack. Wind through trees, the distant call of an owl, the subtle movement of leaves or grass carried by air currents. These sounds filtered into the castle unevenly, sometimes clear, sometimes barely noticeable, depending on the night. During storms or heavy weather, the castle's voice grew louder. Rain tapped against stone. Water found paths through channels and drains, creating steady rhythms. Thunder, when it came, was softened by thick walls, arriving as a low, distant presence rather than a sharp interruption. For those lying awake, these sounds shaped the experience of time. Without light or clock, the night was measured by listening, by noticing patterns repeat, by sensing when the castle grew quieter, then more active again as shifts changed and hours passed. Sound also carried reminders of vulnerability. A door creaking unexpectedly, a noise out of rhythm. These moments prompted brief alertness, bodies tensing slightly before relaxing again when nothing followed. Such vigilance was quiet, habitual, and rarely spoken of. As the night deepened, sounds softened further. Movement slowed. Even the castle itself seemed to settle into a kind of listening. The world narrowed to breath, heartbeat, and the distant murmur of stone and wood existing together in darkness. If you notice your own surroundings now, you may hear similar things. The hum of a room, distant traffic, the quiet shift of air. These sounds, like those of the castle, signal safety as much as presence. They remind you that you are not alone, even as rest deepens. For the people inside medieval castles, these sounds were the background of every night. Not dramatic, not alarming, simply the steady accompaniment to waiting until morning. When night settled fully over the castle, illness and injury did not pause in recognition of the hour. They remained quietly present, often felt more strongly once activity slowed and darkness removed distraction. In these long hours after sunset, discomfort had space to expand, and time seemed to stretch around it. For those who were unwell, night could feel especially slow. Without daylight tasks to occupy the mind, attention returned to the body. A dull ache became more noticeable. A fever felt heavier. Breathing sounded louder in the stillness. These sensations were not new, but they were harder to ignore. There were no physicians moving through the corridors at night. No remedies freshly prepared. Care, when it existed, came from those nearby. A hand placed gently on a shoulder. A blanket adjusted to conserve warmth. A quiet presence sitting close, listening rather than speaking. In shared sleeping spaces, sickness was rarely hidden. A persistent cough echoed softly. Someone shifted often, unable to find comfort. Others nearby noticed, even in darkness. They adjusted their positions slightly, not out of fear but awareness. Illness was part of life, as expected as cold or hunger. Pain, too, felt different at night. During the day, movement and responsibility distracted from it. After sunset, when the body lay still, pain had fewer competitors for attention. An old injury stiffened in the cold. A fresh wound throbbed gently but persistently. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by the need to change position or draw breath carefully. If you imagine lying awake in such a room, you might notice how each minute feels longer than the last. Without clocks, time was measured by sensation, by the slow return of discomfort after shifting, by the number of times one listened to the same sound repeat in the darkness. For children, illness at night often brought quiet reassurance. An adult staying close. A murmured word meant to calm rather than explain. Fear was not encouraged, but neither was false optimism. The night would pass as it always did, 1 hour at a time. Among adults, endurance was the common response. Complaints were rare, not because pain was absent, but because there was little to be gained by voicing it. Attention was directed inward, conserving energy, waiting for morning when something might be done. In more severe cases, the night carried a heavier uncertainty, breathing that became shallow, fever that did not break. These moments were met with stillness rather than panic. Someone might remain awake nearby, watching quietly, noticing small changes, hoping for improvement by dawn. Death, when it came, was rarely dramatic. It arrived softly, without announcement. Someone who had been breathing quietly simply did not wake again. The night accepted this without interruption. Those nearby noticed eventually, but there was no immediate action take. The castle continued to hold its breath until morning. Such moments were not spoken of at length in the dark. Words felt unnecessary. There would be time later for acknowledgement. Night was for waiting, not for resolution. Injury, too, demanded patience. A twisted ankle, a strained muscle, a wound bandaged as well as possible earlier in the day. At night, these were endured rather than treated. Movement was minimized. Sleep, however imperfect, was encouraged. Those responsible for caring roles, midwives, attendants, senior servants, kept a different kind of awareness. Even while resting, they remained slightly alert, listening for changes in breathing, for calls spoken softly out of necessity rather than urgency. Their rest was lighter, shaped by responsibility. As hours passed, fatigue layered itself over discomfort. For some, this brought sleep at last. For others, it brought a quiet acceptance. The understanding that night was not meant to be comfortable, only survivable. If, as you listen now, you feel gratitude for the ease with which help can be reached, for warmth and light available at any hour, that contrast is natural. The people we are describing did not imagine such things. They worked within the limits they knew, enduring nights as they came. Eventually, even the longest night moved toward morning. Illness did not always improve. Injury did not always ease. But dawn brought options. Light, activity, the possibility of response. Until then, the castle held those within it, sick and well alike, wrapped in darkness, waiting patiently for the hours to pass. As the castle settled into its nightly rhythm, some remained awake by necessity. Guards took their positions along the walls, walking slowly and deliberately, their presence steady rather than hurried. Their task was not one of excitement, but of quiet endurance. They were the ones who carried responsibility through darkness, ensuring that the castle held itself safely while the rest of its inhabitants rested. The walls, broad and cold, stretched in both directions, offering both vantage and challenge. Stone underfoot was uneven, sometimes worn smooth in places, rough and jagged in others. The night amplified every sound, the soft shift of leather boots, the scrape of a wooden gate, the distant murmur of the river beyond the outer wall. The guards' eyes adjusted gradually, scanning the darkened courtyard, the spaces between towers, and the land beyond. Patrols moved slowly. Too fast, and fatigue would follow. Too slow, and attention waned. There was a careful balance, a rhythm learned through repetition. One hand rested on the hilt of a sword or the edge of a wall, fingers brushing stone for stability. Every movement was measured, deliberate, designed to conserve energy and maintain awareness. The wind carried a cold that seemed almost patient in its persistence. It slipped beneath cloaks, reached under collars, and reminded guards of the endurance required to stand or move for hours. Breath became visible in the chill, small clouds rising, dissipating, and rising again. It marked the passage of time in a way the absent sun could not. Silence dominated, but it was never absolute. Occasionally, a distant dog barked, a loose shutter banged in the wind, or a far-off horse shifted in its stable. These noises were noted, then assessed. Most were ordinary, expected. Only rarely did the unexpected cause a pause, a subtle adjustment of posture or attention. The towers offered slightly more protection, yet the air at their height was sharper, colder, and often more biting. Guards stationed there learned to lean into walls, to find the least exposed spots, shifting occasionally to prevent numbness from settling too deeply into hands and feet. Fingers and toes were rubbed quietly, movements repeated without drawing attention, almost ceremonial in their routine. In some cases, torches were carried along the wall walk, but lightly. A single flame provided a limited cone of visibility, enough to ensure footing and observe movement near gates or stairs. Torches were not waved or flared. They did not chase shadows. Their light was minimal, steady, controlled, meant to coexist with the darkness rather than compete against it. Communication between guards was deliberate and low. A brief nod, a whisper, or a series of subtle signals indicated changes in post or observed movement. The night required them to speak sparingly, conserving both energy and discretion. Words could travel too far, and the night demanded subtlety. The longer the shift, the more the guards became attuned to the castle itself. They could sense minor shifts in stone, the slight movement of loose tiles, or the echo of distant footsteps that did not belong. Awareness was built not on fear, but on careful observation and patience. Each hour passed slowly, marked by routine rather than excitement. Guards were rarely entirely alone. Even a single companion could make a long shift feel more manageable. Their presence offered reassurance, even when neither spoke. Shared endurance made the night bearable. Still, moments of solitude occurred as one moved from tower to gate, or along stretches of wall where no other post existed nearby. Fatigue was a companion, subtle but constant. Eyes became heavy, muscles stiffened from standing or walking on uneven stone, and warmth ebbed despite clothing and cloaks. Guards learned to recognize the first signs, slower reflexes, heavier eyelids, and to counteract them with small movements or shifts of position. The night would not forgive carelessness, yet it also did not demand dramatic effort. It required steadiness. The castle, in its quiet way, became part of the patrol. Walls provided both a guide and a constraint. Steps followed familiar paths. Corners were anticipated. Open spaces were crossed carefully. Memory was relied upon as much as sight. Every detail mattered, from the placement of a loose stone to the angle of the battlements against the moonlight. Time passed, imperceptibly. Hours merged into one another. Guards counted the shift not by minutes, but by patterns. The slow sweep of a distant branch in the wind. The familiar echo of a gate settling. The rhythm of breath, theirs and those nearby. The night became a long stretch to endure rather than a span to conquer. If you imagine standing beside one of these watchmen, you may notice the patience that fills the cold air. There is no thrill, no alarm, no rapid movement. There is only the continuous awareness that the castle depends on their quiet vigilance. Their energy is measured, their movements controlled, their senses alert yet calm. It is a form of endurance, almost meditative, shaped by hours of repetition and quiet observation. And so, as the rest of the castle lay in shared, uneven slumber, the guards continued. The cold, the darkness, and the vast expanse of stone and shadow defined their experience. The world of the castle at night was small, focused, and deliberate, yet it stretched endlessly for those who moved along its walls. Beneath the high walls, the castle courtyard stretched into shadows, unevenly lit by the faint glow of torches or moonlight spilling over battlements. This open space, larger and less protected than the interiors, was quieter after sunset. Most inhabitants had withdrawn to sleeping chambers, leaving only a few figures moving slowly, purposefully across the cold stones. The courtyard was a place of subtle activity. Servants performed essential tasks that could not wait for daylight. A pile of firewood might be adjusted, stacked carefully to prevent collapse. Barrels containing water or ale were moved quietly, the soft thud against stone echoing just enough to be noticed but not to disturb those resting nearby. Each movement was measured, deliberate, conscious of the hush that darkness demanded. Guard descended from walls to inspect gates and watch the ground level, moving with slow, even steps. They carried the same sense of responsibility as on the battlements, but the courtyard required more attention to detail. Uneven paving stones could twist an ankle. Shadows could hide a drop tool or a stray animal. The eye had to track constantly, following both light and darkness simultaneously. Even animals contributed to the night's quiet rhythm. Horses shifted in stalls at the edge of the courtyard, their movements sending small echoes across the stones. Dogs padded softly alongside their owners, sniffing at corners and boundaries, alert but calm. Their sounds were familiar and expected, a natural part of nighttime life in the castle. The cold was persistent here. Without walls on all sides, wind moved freely across the stones, sometimes gusting sharply before settling. Breath became visible almost immediately. Fingers grew stiff quickly, encouraging hands to remain in pockets or wrapped inside gloves. Even standing still required subtle adjustments, shifting weight, rubbing limbs, drawing shoulders closer. Every guard, every servant, understood that the night demanded endurance. Sound was the primary measure of presence in the courtyard. A drop bucket clanged too loudly. Footsteps carried farther than expected. Whispered instructions or brief responses to orders needed careful moderation. The night encouraged awareness, yet discouraged fuss. Every echo told a story, marking movement, position, or time. Some individuals remained outside by necessity, tending to fires that illuminated outer buildings, checking that gates were securely latched, or adjusting the rope bridges that connected towers. These tasks were repetitive, slow, and required careful attention to avoid error. There was no hurry, only the steady insistence of responsibility. The courtyard also served as a place for quiet observation. Guards would pause, leaning lightly on stone railings or resting a hand on the hilt of a sword. Their eyes scanned the perimeter, while their ears picked up the faintest irregularities. A rustle in the bushes beyond the wall, the creak of a gate turning on its hinges, or the distant echo of a hoofbeat that belonged to someone familiar. Awareness was subtle, continuous, and almost invisible to anyone who did not share their routine. Darkness extended shadows across walls, steps, and piles of equipment. Torches flickered intermittently, their light creating small circles of visibility surrounded by gentle blackness. Figures moved in and out of these small areas of illumination, adjusting to light and shadow as naturally as one breathes. The courtyard, in these hours, was neither entirely bright nor fully dark. It existed in a gradient, a space where awareness and patience guided every movement. Inhabitants who remained awake, perhaps mid-level servants, guards, or attendants, found a peculiar rhythm here. They walked slowly, paused frequently, and listened. Each sound was interpreted, each subtle movement acknowledged. Their own steps were softened, careful not to disrupt the general hush that the courtyard required. Their vigilance was steady rather than dramatic, almost meditative in quality. Animals often mirrored this stillness. Horses stood patiently, occasionally shifting their weight, tails flicking. Dogs moved quietly alongside their owners, ears alert but body relaxed. Even the wind seemed tempered, bending the tips of sparse courtyard plants with gentle insistence rather than force. Time was measured not in minutes, but in these small, repetitive cycles. Step, pause, adjustment, breath, whisper, echo, warmth sought, warmth retained. For those inside the castle walls, the courtyard could be a place of quiet contemplation, though not leisure. Tasks were always purposeful. There was no frivolity, no entertainment. Only the measured care of life persisting through the long, cold hours of night. Each figure present was aware of limits, aware of shadows, aware of the small presence of others nearby, even if they were separated by stone and distance. Eventually, the courtyard became an extension of the castle's body at night. Movement slowed further. Tasks concluded temporarily, waiting for daylight to resume. Guards returned to post. Animals settled into stalls, and the open space assumed a quiet patience, holding the memory of activity until morning returned. High above the courtyard, atop the towers and along the ramparts, guards maintained their posts in a world defined by quiet, cold, and vast darkness. Here, the air was thinner, sharper, and colder still, carrying a sense of both isolation and careful vigilance. The view stretched farther than anywhere below, but in night, distance offered only muted shapes, shadows, and a slow, deliberate awareness of what lay beyond the castle walls. The ramparts were wide but uneven, worn by centuries of footsteps. Each stone held the memory of those who had passed before, though the living depended more on their own senses than the walls themselves. Boots pressed carefully against the stone, avoiding loose fragments that could twist an ankle or cause a stumble. Hands often brushed along the low parapet, a silent guide in darkness, a reassurance against the cold and the drop beyond. Wind swept across the heights relentlessly. It found every gap in armor or clothing, slipping beneath collars and cloaks. Breath formed small clouds, rising, dispersing, and being replaced. The body learned to shift gently, rocking back on heels or circling shoulders to preserve warmth. Stiffness was a constant companion, as were quiet reminders of fatigue that crept gradually over hours of standing or slow walking. The far-off watch demanded patience above all. eyes strained to distinguish shapes against darkness. The faint outline of distant hills, trees, or roads could be discerned only intermittently. Moonlight, when present, provided relief but also cast deceptive shadows. Guards learned to trust movement, patterns, and intuition over clarity of sight. Familiarity with the castle and its surroundings became crucial, each patrol building on memory and careful observation. Occasionally, torches burned along the ramparts. These were not held constantly, but placed in holders at strategic points to provide minimal visibility. Light was small and steady, just enough to prevent missteps. Flickering was quiet, cautious. Shadows stretched and shifted around the flames, reminding watchers that perception could deceive. Figures moved slowly within the radius of light, each step measured, each motion deliberate. Sounds traveled farther here than below. A rustle in the trees outside the walls, the distant call of a nocturnal bird, or the faint echo of movement near the gates all drew attention. Guards listened carefully, distinguishing between ordinary noises and those that might require further scrutiny. Every small shift could indicate something out of place, yet most signals were mundane. A branch moved by wind, a horse shifting in its stall, the settling of stone in a cool night. Time was measured differently at these heights. Without visible clocks, without the distraction of the courtyard, the night seemed to expand. Each hour passed slowly. Breathing, heartbeat, the rhythmic shift of weight from one foot to another, all became markers. A slow rotation along the parapet, a careful inspection of the distant horizon, a glance at the moon's position, all contributed to an understanding of the hour, the distance, the pace of night. The far-off watch was a solitary endeavor more often than not, while other guards patrolled below or occupied towers nearby. These sentries bore the quiet responsibility of vigilance alone. Companionship came in infrequent nods exchanged across distant parapets or quiet acknowledgments from a watchtower. The night, however, was their steady companion, demanding focus without offering distraction. Wind, cold, and height were constant challenges. The hands, partially gloved, shifted to maintain warmth and grip. The cloak fluttered against the stone as the guard adjusted stance. Each breath carried the sharpness of the air, making exhalation visible in the faint torchlight or moonbeam. Standing still for long periods required subtle movements, micro-adjustments, and careful breathing, all unnoticed yet essential to endurance. The perception of distance shaped awareness. Figures far below appeared small, details lost in the muted darkness. Shapes beyond the walls were interpreted slowly, deliberately. Each observation was tested against expectation and experience. Mistakes carried consequences, though rarely immediate. The guard learned patience, the capacity to watch, wait, and note without urgency. In moments of stillness, the night seemed almost alive. Shadows shifted across distant towers, clouds drifted slowly across the sky, and the wind whispered through battlements. The far-off watcher became attuned not only to potential threats, but to subtle rhythms of environment. The slow movement of foliage, the distant murmur of water, the quiet settling of the castle itself as stones cooled further in the night. Even when nothing unusual occurred, time was filled. Observing darkness required engagement. Scanning horizons, checking parapets, listening to distant noises, adjusting clothing against cold, and maintaining balance on uneven stone. Awareness alone was a task, continuous and silent. Eventually, hours passed in their quiet, measured way. Fatigue layered over vigilance, yet endurance carried the watchman forward. The castle's night unfolded with slow precision, shadows and wind acting as companions in quiet observation. Distant lights flickered briefly, perhaps in another tower, perhaps in a torch carried along a wall walk, connecting all watchers into a network of calm alertness. Here, at the highest reaches, the far-off watch reminded that night was not a pause, but a state of sustained presence. Darkness limited perception, but it did not absolve responsibility. The castle rested below, Yet the heights maintained connection to both interior and exterior, to safety and endurance, in ways that demanded patience, steady breathing, and a subtle awareness of the world at large. The night finally began to soften. A subtle change in the darkness signaled the approach of dawn. The air, once cold and heavy with shadows, became a little lighter, though still wrapped in quiet. Along the highest towers and ramparts, faint glimmers hinted at the sun's distant presence beyond hills and forests. Time passed slowly, but its movement could be sensed in the gradual lifting of night. Within the castle, these earliest moments were hushed. The sleeping chambers responded first. Bodies shifted slowly under layers of straw and blankets. Eyes opened, occasionally adjusting to the very faint light that slipped through narrow windows or arrow slits. Movement was gentle, deliberate, careful not to disturb those still resting. The first stirrings of day were cautious, patient, and almost imperceptible. Chilly air filled the rooms as shutters were loosened or lifted. A faint draft carried the scent of morning. Wet earth from the outer bailey, smoke from early fires, and a lingering warmth of last night's hearths. Stretching became a quiet routine, limbs extending slowly to awaken muscles stiff from hours of lying still. Breathing deepened, and the body gradually oriented itself to the new day. In kitchens, the first tasks of dawn began with subdued precision. Fires were rekindled in hearths, kindling the gentle crackle of small flames. Water was drawn quietly from barrels or cisterns, poured carefully to avoid splashing. The smells of wood smoke, warmed stone, and slowly boiling water spread, signaling to the castle that the night's quiet vigil was giving way to morning activity. Servants moved in measured steps, carrying utensils, starting preparations for the day's meals, or adjusting coverings over early food stores. Torches were no longer needed as faint sunlight began to filter in. Shadows shortened and softened, revealing the textures of stone walls, wooden beams, and worn furniture. Everything was revealed gently, without urgency, in the soft illumination of the new day. Courtyards, too, began to respond to this gentle arrival. The cold stone retained the night's chill, but faint patches of sunlight glimmered across paving stones. Guards descended from towers and ramparts, their night-long vigilance giving way to routine inspections of the gates and walls in daylight. Horses in stalls shifted slightly, welcoming a quiet warmth that had not been available during the dark hours. Dogs moved more confidently, tails brushing the stone as they accompanied early risers. The process of waking the castle was not sudden. Unlike modern mornings, there was no rush, no alarm, no sense of urgency. Tasks were initiated slowly, rhythmically, almost ceremoniously. Linen and clothing were adjusted, blankets folded or returned to storage. Bowls were filled, fires tended, and the first simple breakfast prepared. Every movement was measured, deliberate, and patient. For those who had kept watch through the night, dawn was a moment of relief as much as of duty. The fatigue accumulated from long hours of alertness persisted, but the change in light and the knowledge that their shift was ending brought subtle reassurance. Movement along walls or corridors was slower, careful, unhurried. Bodies adjusted gradually to the shift in temperature and activity. The castle's inhabitants, sleepers, watchers, and early risers alike, experienced this moment in different ways. Children stretched lazily, opening eyes to the faint glow of day. Adults adjusted to sensations of warmth, to smells of cooking, and to the low hum of renewed activity. Tasks began to overlap with preparation. Water for cleaning, sweeping of courtyards, readiness of stables and storage. Each action was quiet, careful, necessary, but never rushed. In the higher towers, guards observed the landscape beyond with calm attentiveness. Fog might linger in valleys, dew glistened on plants, and distant hills emerged slowly from night's grip. The soft illumination allowed distant movement to be noted more clearly, yet the quiet vigilance of the night was replaced with steady, methodical observation. Awareness remained, but fatigue softened as the routine of daylight tasks replaced night-long endurance. Sound shifted as well. The faint echoes of night, stones settling, wind through narrow slits, soft breathing, were replaced by the slower hum of life beginning anew. The clatter of bowls, the gentle murmur of servants, the soft shuffle of feet across cold stone, and the distant call of birds heralded the day. Even this increase in noise remained calm, measured, and reassuring rather than disruptive. For those lying in the sleeping chambers, the transition was subtle. Awareness returned gradually. Consciousness stretched fully to incorporate light, sound, and movement. Limbs, still stiff from sleep, adjusted slowly. Eyes took time to focus on familiar surroundings. The body remembered warmth, yet noticed cold drafts that could be corrected with a cloak or adjustment of blankets. Patience carried through these moments as the castle prepared for its routines. Morning was not a moment, but a process. Each small action, the lighting of a hearth, the adjustment of straw bedding, the careful opening of shutters, participated in a larger rhythm. The castle itself seemed to awaken gradually, not with force, but through the cumulative, quiet motions of its inhabitants. It was a collective, unspoken understanding. The night had ended, and the day would follow, slowly, deliberately, gently. As light expanded through narrow windows and across courtyards, the first chores of the day began in a quiet, deliberate manner. The castle's rhythm shifted from the patient endurance of night to the careful, methodical work of morning, where every movement mattered, and every task, no matter how small, contributed to the survival of those within its walls. In the kitchens, fires were stoked with gentle persistence. Ashes from the previous night were stirred and settled, embers nurtured to life once more. Water, drawn slowly from cisterns, poured carefully into cauldrons and basins, ensuring no splash wasted the precious resource. The smell of damp stone mixed with smoke, creating an atmosphere both familiar and reassuring. Tasks were repeated, measured, each motion deliberate, never hurried. Servants moved quietly across flagstones, carrying bowls, baskets, and bundles. Each footstep was considered. Stones, still cold from night, pressed unevenly beneath their feet, reminding them of both care and balance. Even when performing routine duties, attention remained sharp. Spilled grain could attract pests. A mislaid tool could interrupt work later. Small mistakes carried consequences, yet the pace remained gentle and reflective. Outside, the courtyard slowly brightened, revealing details previously hidden in darkness. Horses stirred in their stalls, shifting weight carefully to regain circulation after long hours of stillness. Stable hands adjusted tack, gently brushing down animals, checking hooves for issues that might have arisen overnight. Every movement was measured, avoiding startling the creatures that, despite their size, were part of the castle's delicate balance. Water from troughs glimmered in early light. Servants tended to these sources methodically, ensuring that animals had enough without splashing the surrounding stones or wasting precious supplies. Even the sound of moving water was subdued, echoing softly against stone walls rather than dominating the quiet morning. This careful approach extended to all tasks: sweeping, arranging supplies, stacking firewood, or tending small gardens where herbs were grown for flavor or medicinal purposes. In the sleeping chambers, those who had endured night-long discomfort or illness rose slowly. A blanket adjusted here, a straw mat straightened there. Movements were gentle, meant to conserve strength rather than draw attention. The castle's inhabitants were aware of each other's vulnerabilities, yet the day's chores required continuation. Survival was subtle, unspoken, and persistent. The courtyard itself became a stage for quiet survival. Early morning chores included checking gates, inspecting walls, and ensuring that all access points were secure. Guards conducted their rounds slowly, repeating patterns established over weeks and months. Every post was observed not with urgency, but with awareness. Wind, shifting stones, and loose tiles were accounted for as naturally as one breathed. Attention to detail was survival, even in seemingly simple tasks. Food preparation, another element of survival, began with repetition and care. Grain was sifted and measured. Water was heated for porridge or bread preparation. Fires were managed to avoid waste of fuel, their smoke rising softly rather than flaring into sudden brightness. The smell of cooking was subtle, blending with the damp and earthy tones of the castle, filling the air without overwhelming it. These actions, repeated day after day, were essential to the quiet endurance of all who lived within the walls. Small injuries or lingering ailments, so noticeable at night, were now tended with careful precision. Bandages were checked, water applied to clean wounds, and the sick or injured assisted with minor movements or positioning. Even these simple acts required patience. Fatigue from a night lingered, and attention to comfort as much as necessity guided every hand. Survival was quiet, methodical, and respectful. The castle's animals also participated in this slow return to activity. Birds might begin their morning calls, muted by the high walls. Dogs, now alert to daylight, padded along cobblestones, sniffing and shifting in anticipation of routines yet to begin. Horses stretched, shifted, and shifted again, their movements gentle but deliberate, echoing the slow rhythm of the castle's inhabitants. The harmony of activity was quiet, persistent, and steady. Throughout all of these moments, the castle itself responded to human presence. Stone absorbed warmth from first sunlight. Wooden beams creaked gently as they settled after night-long cold. Windows rattled lightly in shifting breezes. Even small noises carried significance. A drop pan or a rustle in straw signaled attention, awareness, and, at times, the need for correction. These responses were subtle, expected, and rarely remarked upon. Survival depended as much on patience and repetition as on immediate action. By mid-morning, the castle had transitioned fully into the day, yet its pace remained measured. Tasks were completed one by one, each observed for care and precision. Every action reflected an understanding of limitations, time, strength, and available resources, ensuring that nothing essential was neglected. There was no rush, no flurry, only the calm continuity of necessity. Even in these early hours, the lessons of night lingered. Awareness, endurance, and careful observation continued to guide movements. Those who had kept watch or tended to the sick understood that survival demanded vigilance, attention, and respect for limits. Chores became a continuation of the quiet patience that night had instilled, a bridge from endurance to the practical rhythms of daytime life. The castle, in all its stone, timber, and life, moved slowly, deliberately, and consistently. Every task, no matter how minor, contributed to the ongoing persistence of those within. The rhythm of survival was neither loud nor dramatic. It was subtle, continuous, and dependent upon the steady, gentle attention of those awake at the first light of morning. By mid-morning, the castle had fully transitioned from the hushed persistence of night into a slower, deliberate rhythm of day. Light had expanded through narrow windows, arrow slits, and open gates, illuminating stone corridors, timber beams, and rough-hewn furniture. Shadows, once long and soft, were shorter now, retreating into corners as gentle sunbeams highlighted the textures and subtle irregularities of the walls and floors. Those who had been awake since the first glimmers of dawn continued their tasks at a careful, patient pace. In the kitchens, servants tended fires, stirred stewing ingredients, and measured grain or water with repeated, deliberate motions. Nothing was hurried. Each movement, each adjustment, was performed with an awareness of precision and preservation. Utensils were handled carefully. Bowls were placed gently on stone surfaces. Spilled flour or water would be cleaned quietly, as the consequences of waste or disarray were known intimately. Corridors echoed, faintly with footfalls, though still subdued. The sound of slippers or soft leather boots against stone reminded the inhabitants of presence without breaking the calm. Servants moved with purpose, yet their motions were smooth and measured. Occasionally, A whispered word passed between them, or a small gesture, a nod, a hand raised slightly, communicated instruction or acknowledgement. Conversation remained minimal, limited to necessity, preserving the quiet patience that the castle's rhythm demanded. Courtyards and outer areas saw similar activity. Horses shifted in stalls, being led gently by handlers for feeding or cleaning. Dogs patrolled, not by command, but through habitual presence. Noses occasionally lifted to scent the wind. Gates were checked, hinges oiled, ropes and pulleys observed. Every detail mattered, but nothing required rush. Observation was the tool of survival, a steady awareness rather than hurried intervention. The inhabitants observed one another carefully, though subtly. A servant carrying a basket might adjust posture when noticing a companion stiff from sleep. A guard walking through the yard might shift direction slightly upon spotting a loose paving stone or a small patch of dampness. Eyes and hands worked together, noting, adjusting, ensuring that the castle functioned smoothly while maintaining calm. Every gesture was part of a larger, continuous pattern of observation, care, and endurance. Those who attended to illness or injury through the night continued with quiet diligence. Bandages were checked, small adjustments made to bedding, and the comfort of each individual monitored discreetly. The sick or weak were often positioned near gentle sunlight, receiving warmth without disturbance, while caregivers moved slowly, balancing attention to multiple responsibilities. Patience was paramount, and urgency was rare. Life moved steadily, deliberately. Tasks were repetitive, but repetition provided rhythm. Wood was gathered for fires, swept, and stacked carefully. Water was drawn, carried, and poured into basins or troughs. Food stores were organized and supplies inspected. The castle itself, stone walls, timber beams, iron fittings, was examined gently, noting loose or damaged areas, adjusting what could be corrected immediately, and recording concern for later attention. Observation extended beyond immediate need, encompassing the anticipation of future comfort and survival. Inhabitants also observed the natural world through openings, windows, and courtyard gates. Birds flitted briefly between buildings, their calls quiet yet distinct. Leaves rustled softly in morning breezes. Clouds moved lazily across the sky. Awareness of these small details was habitual, enhancing the understanding of the environment and providing subtle guidance for daily routines. Patterns were noted. The angle of sunlight, the shift of wind, the presence of moisture or frost, all factors considered gently in the flow of activities. Movement, while purposeful, remained calm. Servants and guards alike adjusted pace according to the demands of balance, cold, or fatigue. Steps were measured to avoid unnecessary strain, each shift of weight deliberate. Limbs were stretched and flexed when stiffness threatened comfort. Hands were rubbed or pressed against warm surfaces to restore circulation. These small, quiet actions supported the endurance required for continuous work. The mid-morning hours also allowed for moments of reflection, though brief and unobtrusive. A guard pausing at a gate might glance toward the distant hills, noting shapes and colors against the sky. A servant stacking firewood could observe the interplay of sunlight on stone, the faint movement of shadows, and the gentle warmth creeping into corners. These observations were not idle, but a quiet engagement with the world, a calibration of awareness and presence. Time, at this stage, was measured not by clocks, but by observation, sensation, and routine. The sun's angle, the warming of stone, the movement of animals, and the gentle rustling of air all marked the passage of hours. Work continued in cadence with these subtle signals, maintaining the castle's life while respecting its pace and the limits of those who inhabited it. Even small errors were corrected calmly. A dish slightly out of place was returned gently. A piece of straw bedding displaced in the night was straightened without fuss. Attention to detail was constant but patient, understanding that the castle's needs were ongoing rather than urgent. Survival and comfort were maintained through slow, deliberate action, repeated and observed carefully. By mid-morning, the castle was fully alive in its own quiet way. The rhythm of survival persisted alongside routine, a balance between observation, endurance, and gentle motion. Every inhabitant, whether tending animals, preparing food, maintaining walls, or caring for one another, contributed to this subtle orchestration. The day unfolded steadily, ensuring continuity, safety, and the quiet preservation of life within the stone and timber confines. And so, mid-morning existed as a bridge between night-long vigilance and the fuller tasks of daytime. Observation, movement, and care continued, never rushed, never dramatic. The castle moved as a living system, each part attending to its role, aware of the whole, patient and measured in the rhythm of survival. As the sun began its slow descent, the castle gradually shifted once more into a quieter rhythm. Midday warmth gave way to a cooler embrace. Shadows lengthened along stone corridors, and the air thickened slightly with the scent of hearths and animals. The cycle of day, measured in light, movement, and care, drew toward its gentle close. Within these walls, life was both persistent and subdued, a delicate balance between endurance and repose. Servants completed their chores in measured steps. Firewood was res-tacked, water vessels returned to their proper places, and tools tidied carefully. The stones, which had felt the weight of boots and hands throughout the day, grew silent again, absorbing the warmth and soft sounds of fading activity. Each person worked slowly, not hurried by the end of day, but guided by the quiet awareness that their labor had ensured the castle's survival and comfort. Courtyards emptied gradually as animals were returned to stalls and gates secured. Horses shifted their weight with calm familiarity, tails flicking lazily at flies, ears attentive but relaxed. Dogs curled near hearths or lay quietly beside their masters, accustomed to the routine of day. Every creature within the castle contributed to this pattern of gentle closure, their movements part of the larger, almost imperceptible rhythm of life winding down. The last tasks of the day were performed with deliberate care. Shutters and doors were adjusted against the cool night air. Torches and lamps were prepared for evening use, their placement considered carefully so that soft light would illuminate essential spaces without disturbing sleep or quiet reflection. Fire pits in the kitchens and halls were monitored, small flames nurtured to continue warmth without excess. Every action was slow, precise, and mindful. For the castle's inhabitants, these moments carried both relief and anticipation. Relief from the day's work, from the careful observation of movement, from the maintenance of walls, animals, and supplies. Anticipation of rest, the opportunity to stretch upon straw or fold themselves under blankets. Even those who had been vigilant through the night understood that evening was a time for measured recovery. The cycle of care, observation, and endurance would continue with the night, but the approach of dusk allowed a softer, slower transition. Stone corridors echoed faintly with footsteps, but gradually the sounds diminished. Conversations were minimal, limited to essential communication. The castle's vast spaces, halls, stairways, and courtyards resonated instead with quiet presence. It was a presence of awareness, of calm, of steady attention without urgency. The shift from day to night was subtle, almost imperceptible, but felt in every movement and every breath. Inside the chambers, individuals prepared for the night. Simple meals were consumed, modest in quantity, but sufficient for sustenance. Bowls and utensils were returned carefully to storage. Blankets were adjusted, mats straightened, and small comforts arranged with patience. Each gesture was thoughtful, ensuring warmth, comfort, and the preservation of strength. Fatigue from the day's activities and from the vigilance of the night ahead was acknowledged quietly, without complaint or dramatization. Inhabitants often paused for reflection, however brief, observing the fading light across battlements, the way shadows deepened in corners, or the subtle warmth lingering in sunlit stone. They absorbed the rhythm of the castle and the environment. This awareness was both practical and meditative, a recognition of place, of duty, and of the quiet persistence that sustained life here. Even in moments of rest, consciousness remained attuned to surroundings. As darkness returned, the castle embraced a soft, patient stillness. The wind shifted along ramparts and through courtyards, brushing against stone and timber. Animals settled into familiar positions, low sounds of breathing or subtle movements becoming part of the subdued soundscape. Torches and lamps flickered gently, illuminating essential spaces while leaving most areas in muted shadow. Life was present, measured, and contained within the rhythm of survival. The contrast between this existence and the comfort of modern life is quietly striking. There were no soft mattresses, no gentle heating, no conveniences to lighten labor. Yet within its simplicity, the castle provided order, structure, and a subtle reassurance. Every day was governed by necessity, careful observation, and steady patience. Each person, animal, and even the castle's architecture contributed to a system of endurance that was deliberate, slow, and purposeful. Night brought its own challenges, as it always had. Cold persisted in corners untouched by hearths. Shadows shifted unpredictably. Sounds carried differently in darkness, requiring continued attention even in rest. Yet these hardships were met with quiet resolve rather than fear. The castle's inhabitants had learned to move gently, to breathe slowly, to conserve energy, and to preserve warmth. Endurance was woven into every action, every posture, and every moment of observation. Eventually, even those still awake lowered their activity. Conversations dwindled to whispers or ceased entirely. Eyes grew heavy. Limbs, accustomed to the day's repetition, finally relaxed. The castle, long accustomed to cycles of light and dark, activity and stillness, assumed a patient, enduring calm. Every corner, corridor, and chamber returned to gentle quiet. The living, the watchers, the caregivers, and the animals shared this collective pause, each sustaining life in its measured, unhurried way. Sleep arrived gradually, without fanfare. Individuals settled into straw beds or simple mats, adjusted cloaks for warmth, and closed eyes with deliberate care. Breath deepened, heart rates slowed, and the body released tension accumulated from labor and vigilance. Even the sounds of the castle, the creak of timber, the settling of stone, the rustle of straw, blended into a soothing accompaniment to rest. The night's quiet endurance had returned, now shared by all, and the cycle continued. In these final hours before dawn, the castle embodied a subtle lesson. Survival was not dramatic, nor was it loud. It was slow, careful, patient, and continuous. Every action, every adjustment, every observation contributed to comfort and safety. Each day, each night, each cycle of light and darkness reaffirmed this pattern. Life within these walls moved quietly, deliberately, and persistently, guided by rhythm, awareness, and subtle care. The reflection on such a life, as one observes it from the perspective of modern convenience, emphasizes its gentle resilience. There is no spectacle, no grandeur, no dramatized peril. Yet within simplicity and repetition exists a depth of endurance, of awareness, and of quiet observation that sustained those who lived and worked within the castle for generations. It is a history of patience, subtlety, and careful attention, a story to soothe, to steady, and to calm. And so, as the castle rests once more, let us also allow ourselves to follow its rhythm. Breathe slowly, release tension, and sink into a gentle, unhurried state. Reflect on the quiet perseverance of those who came before, their lives measured in stone, shadow, and soft endurance. Let the calm and steady heartbeat of history lull you into rest, a gentle companion to the rhythm of night. With the castle in repose, with the courtyard emptied and towers silent, with every fire maintained yet subdued, and every inhabitant resting or preparing quietly for the night, the day comes full circle. Darkness has returned with soft inevitability. Sleep is the final task, the continuation of calm, and the gentle preservation of strength. Here, within these walls, life is measured, deliberate, and patient, reminding us that the quiet persistence of ordinary people is often the truest endurance of all.